Welcome back, Velvet Family. Tonight, we're diving into a story wrapped in ice, secrets, and the love that wasn't meant to exist. Imagine this. Two strangers, heirs to empires, forced into marriage, not by choice, but by contract. No passion, no promises, only duty. On the surface, they're the perfect couple. But behind closed doors, they're colder than strangers. This is the Frozen Vows. In chapters 1 through 4, you'll witness a marriage built on paper, not love, a bride with no emotions, a groom who refuses to be ignored, and a dangerous tension that grows each time their eyes meet. From the ceremony of strangers, to cracks in the ice, to a confession that changes everything, this story will leave you hooked, craving what happens next. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to The Velvet Story and hit that bell so you don't miss a single chapter. And if you want the next 3 chapters faster, make sure to like this video. Your support keeps these stories alive. The Frozen Vows. Chapter 1. The Ceremony of Strangers. The wedding hall was drenched in golden light, chandeliers sparkling like constellations overhead. Guests whispered behind delicate champagne glasses, some smiling, some pitying, all watching the union of 2 of the wealthiest heirs in the city. At the altar, Aria Wen stood still as porcelain, her face calm, her dark eyes unreadable. She was a bride, yet her lips never trembled in nervousness, never curled in joy. To anyone who looked too closely, she appeared less like a bride and more like a statue wearing white. Beside him, Damian Li, the cold heir to the Li conglomerate, signed his name on the marriage contract with the same detached composure he used in boardrooms. His tailored black suit fit him like armor, and his face, sharp as a blade, betrayed no emotion. When their hands brushed briefly as they exchanged rings, Aria did not flinch. She did not blush. She merely slid the ring onto his finger, as if it were a part of a transaction. Because it was. The officiator's words blurred into background noise. Vows were recited, but not felt. A pause filled the room as the announcement came. "You may kiss the bride." Damian leaned in, his movement precise, rehearsed, almost mechanical. His lips barely grazed hers, just enough for the cameras flashing from every corner. Aria's eyes never closed. She stared straight ahead, her mind as blank as her expression. Inside, she thought, "So, this is marriage. A deal. Nothing more. Nothing less." Later, when the guests had retreated into laughter and music, Damian finally spoke to her in private for the first time that night. His voice was smooth, low, yet impersonal, like he was addressing a colleague. "Damian, we've done our part. From here on, we'll play the roles our parents expect. Beyond that, our lives remain our own." Aria turned to face him fully. Her beauty was undeniable, but it carried no warmth. She nodded once. "Agreed. Publicly, I'll be Mrs. Li. Privately, I'll be a stranger. I don't interfere in your life. You don't interfere in mine." There was no hesitation in her tone, no hidden disappointment. It was the same way she might state the terms of a business deal. For a moment, Damian studied her. Her voice carried no tremor, her eyes no flicker. She was serious. And for reasons he couldn't place, something about that unsettled him. The days that followed were exactly as they promised. At the mansion, they crossed paths only occasionally. At breakfast, where Aria silently stirred her tea, while Damian scrolled through market reports. In the evenings, when she returned from her own work and disappeared into the study without a word.
At public events, however, they became the perfect couple, arm in arm, smiling faintly for cameras, whispering words that sounded like affection, but were hollow rehearsals. Society praised them. What a powerful pair! So harmonious, so elegant. But when the lights dimmed and the crowd faded, silence filled the mansion again. One evening, after a particularly glamorous gala, Damian leaned against the car as Aria stepped inside. She adjusted the folds of her silver gown, her face expressionless, even under the soft glow of the street lamps. Damian lightly, testing. "You play your part well. Almost too well." Aria tilted her head, meeting his eyes briefly before looking away. "It's what we agreed upon. Most women would at least pretend to be happy. Or at least curious about their husband." Her lips curved not in a smile, but in something close to mockery. "Then perhaps you married the wrong woman." Her words landed sharp, yet her tone remained calm, like cold water poured over fire. Damian's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He wasn't used to being dismissed so easily. That night, when Damian passed by her study, he saw the faint light spilling from under the door. He paused. For reasons unknown, even to himself, he almost knocked, but the silence beyond the door was so complete, so detached, that he found himself turning away. Inside, Aria sat at her desk, a book open before her. Her thoughts were steady, unshaken. "I won't let this arrangement affect me. He is my husband in name only, nothing more. No matter what he says, no matter how he looks at me, my heart will remain mine." She closed the book, extinguished the lamp, and went to bed, without a single flutter in her chest. And so their marriage began, not as lovers, not even as friends, but as strangers bound by paper and rings. Two figures carved from ice, standing side by side, yet worlds apart. Neither of them knew them, but the ice would not hold forever.
Chapter 2. Ice Meeting Ice. The Li mansion was vast enough for two strangers to live inside without colliding. Corridors stretched long and silent, polished marble reflecting the glint of chandeliers, servants moving quietly like shadows. In the early weeks of their marriage, Aria and Damian crossed paths only when routine demanded it. At the breakfast table, the occasional evening meal, or a social obligation neither could refuse. And every time, their interactions were as smooth, polished, and lifeless as glass. Breakfast. Damian sat at the head of the long mahogany table, reading the financial reports on his tablet. His suit was already crisp, tie knotted perfectly. He was a man who looked like he'd woken straight into a business meeting. Aria entered silently, her heels clicking softly against the floor. She wore a pale blouse and a pencil skirt, hair tied in a simple knot, not a strand out of place. She sat opposite him, no greeting, no smile. The maid poured tea. She stirred it once, twice, 3 times. The sound of the spoon clinking in its porcelain was the only proof she was alive. Damian lowered his tablet slightly. His gaze flicked to her hands. Slim, steady, precise. No fidgeting, no hesitation. She could have been a painting, elegant and utterly devoid of life. He cleared his throat. "There's a charity banquet tonight. We'll attend together." Aria calmly. "Noted." And that was the end of the conversation. That evening, the world saw a different pair. At the banquet hall, Damian's hand rested at the small of Aria's back, guiding her through the crowd. To the onlookers, they were flawless, the Li heir and his perfect bride.
She smiled faintly when necessary, leaned in as though listening to his whispers, even brushed your hand against his arm like a loving wife. Damian played his role effortlessly too, lowering his head as though to murmur in her ear, lips curvy in just the right degree of affection. Cameras flashed, people sighed. Guest woman, they look so in love. But when they stepped into the car afterwards, the illusion was shattered. Aria looked out the window, her expression once again blank, as if she had left her smile behind in the banquet hall. Damian loosened his tie, glancing at her reflection in the glass. Something pricked at him, a strange dissatisfaction. Damian, lightly, almost easingly, "You're quite the actress." Aria, without turning, "It's not acting, it's duty." Damian, "You make it sound so empty." At that, she finally looked at him, her gaze steady, dark, cold. Aria, "Because it is." For a moment, he was caught off guard. Most women he knew would have flushed at his attention, stumbled to soften their words, tried to please him. She, however, delivered truth like a blade, smooth, sharp, unapologetic.
He smirked faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You're a curious woman, Aria Wen. Curiosity is unnecessary in this arrangement." And just like that, she turned her head back toward the city lights flashing by. Conversation over. Days bled into weeks. The silence between them was constant, yet, strangely, not uncomfortable. Damian began to notice things he hadn't before. The way Aria read thick books late into the night, her posture never slouching, her eyes unwavering. The way she answered invasive questions from society ladies with a polite, frozen smile that revealed nothing. Once at a social luncheon, a young heiress leaned in with false sweetness. "It must be difficult living with someone as intimidating as Mr. Li." Aria sipped her tea calmly before replying, voice soft but cutting. "Not at all. I hardly notice he's there." The table erupted in laughter, but Damian, seated beside her, nearly choked on his wine. He glanced at her sideways. She wasn't joking. That night, he found himself replaying the moment. Her words should have insulted him, but instead, they intrigued him. Most people bend under his presence. She ignored it completely. She doesn't flinch. She doesn't fall. She doesn't care. Who exactly is this woman I married? One evening, Damian passed by the garden on his way back from a late meeting. Through the glass doors, he saw Aria standing among the roses, moonlight catching the silver of her nightgown. She wasn't admiring the flowers. She wasn't daydreaming. She simply stood still, gazing up at the moon as though even it could not stir her. Damian's chest tightened unexpectedly. Not an affection. No, not yet. It was something else. An itch. A pull. The need to understand the woman who treated him like heir. For the first time, Damian Li realized he wanted her attention. And that desire, faint as it was, would be the first crack in his ice. End of Chapter 2, Ice Meeting Ice. Chapter 3, Subtle Cracks. The Li mansion remained quiet as always. Days slipped past like ripples on still water, undisturbed, cold, endless. But Damian Li was not a man who enjoyed being ignored. At first, her indifference had been convenient. She never nagged, never asked questions, never pried into his business. She was the perfect contractual wife. Yet now, after weeks of silence, it gnawed him. He caught himself waiting for her to squeak at breakfast, watching the way she stirred her tea without ever tasting the sugar,
wondering why her eyes never revealed anything. It wasn't an attraction, not yet. It was irritating, mixed with curiosity.
The first test. One morning, he broke the silence. Damian broke the silence, casual as if offhand. I heard your university friend visited town. Did you meet her? Aria lifted her gaze from her tea, her expression flat. No. Why not? Because there was no need. No elaboration, no softness in her voice. She went back to her tea. Damian's jaw tightened. Does nothing matter to her? The second test. At another dinner, he leaned closer than usual, letting his hand brush against hers beneath the table. For most women, the contact would have drawn a blush, a frick, or anything. Aria didn't even blink. Instead, she calmly moved her hand away, picked up her fork, and cut her steak with the same composure as before. She didn't acknowledge the touch, nor his deliberate attempt. For the first time in years, Damian felt invisible. The third test. At a charity gala, they posed for photos. Damian slipped his arm more firmly around her waist, his fingers pressing lightly against her hip. To the cameras, it looked affectionate, but his eyes, sharp and calculating, were focused entirely on her reaction. Aria's faint smile remained fixed, flawless. Her posture didn't waver. She leaned into him just enough for the perfect shot. Inside, she was thinking, this is the contract, appearances, nothing else. When the flash faded, she gently stepped out of his hold as if returning borrowed property. Damian's chest tightened again, not with hurt, but with something more dangerous, a need. That night, back in the mansion, Damian cornered her in the hallway. His voice was low, colder than usual. Do you really feel nothing? Aria looked at him, her eyes still calm, unshaken. About whom? About me. A pause. Her expression remained unreadable. Should I? The words were delivered like a knife, plunged straight into his chest, sharp, merciless, leaving no wound visibly, a cutting deep inside. For the first time, Damian found himself speechless. He, the man who commanded boardrooms, who bent competitors on the single glare, couldn't get a reaction from his own wife. Aria's eyes lingered on him for a heartbeat. Then she turned and walked away, her heels echoing softly down the hall. Damian stood there alone, with his hand clenched. What is she? He thought bitterly. A woman of ice or something colder. But the truth was far simpler. Aria Wen was exactly what you appeared to be. A woman untouched by love, untouched by emotion. At least, for now. And for Damian Li, who had always believed he'd never care for anyone, her indifference was the very spark that began to thaw his frozen wells. End of Chapter 3. Subtle Traps.
Chapter 4. Confession and Flight. The tension between them grew like an invisible storm. Damian had told himself countless times this was just a contract. Her indifference should not matter. Yet the more she ignored him, the more he found himself seeking her gaze, her voice, anything. It was maddening. And tonight, he couldn't hold it in anymore. The confrontation. The rain pounded against the tall glass windows of the study. Damian stood near the fireplace, his jacket discarded, tie loosened. His eyes followed Aria as she closed the book in her hands with her usual composure. Damian, low, tight. Aria. She lifted her head. Yes? For a moment, he said nothing. He searched her face, so calm, so empty, and felt something twist inside him. Damian, I want this marriage to be more than paper. Aria's brows lifted slightly, but there was no flicker of surprise in her eyes. She waited, silent. Damian stepped closer, his voice rougher now. I like you. Not for the contract, not for the appearances, for you. The words hung heavy in the room, louder than the storm outside.
But Aria's expression didn't soften. Her voice was as cold as ever. Aria, you shouldn't. Damian froze. What? Aria, you shouldn't like me. I can't return it. Her tone carried no hesitation, no pain, just cold fact, like reciting a weather report. Damian's jaw clenched. For the first time, he felt the sharp sting of rejection. Not because he hated him, but because she felt nothing at all. Damian, bitterly. You're saying I mean nothing to you? Aria met his gaze, calm and unwavering. Aria, that's correct. The silence that followed was unbearable. Damian's fists tightened to the sides, his pride screaming, but his chest aching in a way he'd never known. Aria turned away, her voice quiet but firm. We agreed from the beginning, strangers in private. That hasn't changed. And with that, she left the study. The echo of her footsteps down the hall struck Damian harder than any insult ever had. The avoidance. The days that followed were colder than before. At breakfast, Aria arrived later, leaving sooner. At public events, she fulfilled her role with flawless grace. But the moment cameras were gone, she distanced herself. At home, she locked herself in her study more often, the light under her door burning late into the night. Damian tried to ignore the ache in his chest, but each time she walked past him without even a glance, it deepened. One night, he found himself standing outside her study door, fist raised as if to knock. He hesitated for minutes. Then, with a frustrated curse, he walked away. Inside, Aria stared at the page of her book, but absorbed none of the words. She hadn't lied. She felt nothing. But for the first time, she noticed his confession lingered in her mind longer than it should have. And that unsettled her. The flight. Weeks later, Aria requested a solo trip abroad, citing, quote, business for the Wen Corporation. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. She needed distance, away from his eyes, away from the growing tension, away from the faint echo of his voice saying, I like you. When she handed Damian the itinerary, his eyes darkened. Damian, you're running from me. Aria, I'm fulfilling my obligations. Damian, low, bitter, to everyone but me. Ariel didn't respond. She slipped the papers onto his desk, bowed her head politely, and walked away. Damian stared at the pages, his chest burning. For the first time in his life, he felt powerless, and he hated it. That night, as the rain returned to lash against the windows, Damian stood alone in the mansion. The silence pressed down on him heavier than ever. And he realized he didn't want silence anymore. End of Chapter 4, Confession and Flight. And that brings us to the end of Chapter 4 of The Frozen Vows. Aria Wen remains untouchable, an emotionless bride who insists her art belongs to no one. Damian Li, the man who swore he'd never care, now finds himself restless, desperate for the one woman who treats him like he doesn't exist. But after his heartfelt confession, she ran, a flight to escape him, or maybe to escape herself. The question is, will distance freeze them further apart, or will it be the fire that finally melts the ice? The storm between them is only begun, Ben. Trust me, what's coming will shatter everything they thought they knew about love. Pain
and fate. If you enjoyed this journey through chapters 1 through 4, don't forget to like this video and let me know in the comments if you're Team Damian or Team Aria. Your likes will unlock the next 3 chapters sooner. And if you haven't already, subscribe to The Velvet Story, where love and betrayal collide in unforgettable tales. Until next time, Velvet family, keep your hearts warm because winter is only just begun in the Fruit and Vows.